I'm more concerned about, and there's now a growing literature in macroeconomics, are what are known as kind of the missing Einsteins. I mean, think about how many people in world history could have been the next great thinker that ended up on some farm somewhere, in rural China. And if that's the case, then I think humanity as a whole is in such a better condition than it has been. I mean, for my money, it's really the eradication of absolute poverty that is the most important thing. I think the answer is still today. The best time to be born in human history is today, especially if you didn't know where you were going to be born.
Welcome back to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. Today we're looking at a question that sits at the center of everything this channel is about. How did human progress actually happen? This clip is selected from my full interview with Dr. Rubin about a year and a half ago. Jared spent his career studying these turning points and why they mattered. And next week, we'll look at another moment where history could have taken a different path, the early years of World War I. My guest will argue that had power been checked in a different way in 1915, in a plausible alternative method, the 20th century and our lives today might look radically more prosperous, and this possibility still lies in the future. So if you're new here, now's a great time to subscribe, and let's get to the interview. Let's start with the conclusions of your book. How did the world become so rich? What were the driving economic factors, and should Americans be so pessimistic?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. There's definitely a disconnect between where we are, not just in the US or in the West or in the rich world, and the feeling, I think, of where we are. So what we do in our book, and it's a book co-authored with Mark Koyama, George Mason, we highlight five main theses that have arisen, say, in the last 15 to 20 years, and some of them even longer, on why certain parts of the world have become well off and others have not. One is geography. Now, geography includes things like having access to navigable rivers, or in some cases having access to the Atlantic, like in the early modern period, or climate. There's certain types of climates that are suitable for certain types of crops, or are too cold or too warm. The disease environment, things like that. The problem with geographical explanations, though, is that their geography stays the same for the most part. So it has a real hard time explaining reversals of fortunes, which there have been plenty of. China was well ahead of Western Europe. The Middle East was well ahead of Western Europe for a long time, especially after the fall of Rome. Yet it was in Western Europe, particularly Northwestern Europe, where the modern economy emerged. So we have to dig a little deeper. A couple others that we don't highlight as much, but we discuss in depth, are demography, so births and deaths, things like that. And this was a transition to lower birth and lower death rates. So even in wealthy countries, when people could afford to have many, many kids, they start having 2 or 3 kids. Now we might be in a crisis now, though, on the other hand, where that can be taken too far, and the replacement level in most wealthy countries, and actually increasingly in less wealthy countries, is below replacement, meaning below about 2.1 children per woman. Another one is colonialism. Certain parts of the world have fallen behind and are still behind because of the role of colonialism. And this would certainly be the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where the slave trade just decimated the continent for centuries. There's 2 final explanations, and these are ones we place a little more emphasis on. The first one's institutions. Institutions are those things that that create the constraints that people face. So like legal institutions, political institutions. So the famous Nobel Prize winning economist Douglas North called them the rules of the game. We can think about it as helping shape the costs and benefits. So there's what are called quote unquote good institutions, and all that's meant by that is good for economic development. A commonly ascribed one there, things that place constraints on executive power, on political rule. So an authoritarian, under authoritarian rule, it's much less likely, though clearly not impossible, it's as in the case of China, to grow. And historically, most places that really grew economically had enough constraints on executive power where you kind of unilateral authoritarian power just didn't exist. There's plenty of others too, like a well-functioning legal system, market activity, reasonably well-functioning markets, I should say. All these are institutions. And the other big broad class of explanations we ascribe to are culture. But when we're talking about culture, we're talking about, the way people view the world. And there are things that matter and differ across cultures, like trust in others. You need trust for market activity to work. And really, in the end, what we argue, that there's a lot of evidence for, is it's not just institutions, it's not just culture, it's the combination between them, and how they work together. And it's also how some of these other explanations work with other explanations. So, geography might matter. It might matter even more for shaping the types of institutions a society has. So where a society is constantly fearful of attack, they might generate institutions that help gain tax revenue, right? Because they're going to need that tax revenue to fend off invaders, which in the long run might actually be positive. And there's actually, a lot of good research that suggests precisely this. So there's a lot that I just said there, and I know that, we probably need to parse it down a little bit, but those are the overarching explanations that Mark and I give in this book.
You prominently displayed one element of history that led you to the conclusion of institutions, and it's worth discussing, and that is the condition of England from the year 1000 to 1750, when things began to really tick up. And it's probably worth going into how important a role that was in how you looked at everything.
Definitely. I mean, I don't think you can write a book called How the World Became Rich and not spend a decent amount of time on England or, later Britain, because that is where it really the modern economy started.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $36 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 80 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com.
Really, really beginning in the mid 18th century, but it really took off in the 19th. And then there were a lot of followers who took some of the things that Britain had and made it their own. So in the context of what we just said, institutions, clearly play a role, and I just should preface this by saying, I'm about to talk about Britain. None of any of these elements were unique to Britain. What was unique to Britain was all of them being combined in one place. So when we talk about institutions, in the course of the 16th and 17th century, under the Tudors and Stuarts, there was a transition, really on the one hand, away from religion playing a big role in politics that happened with the Reformation, but also more generally to Parliament becoming quite strong and really being able to constrain royal power. And they fought a civil war and then had a glorious revolution in the 17th century. But by the end of all of this, political rule was relatively constrained, meaning that you had a lot of power in Parliament, and this was relatively democratic. But relative to what other societies, or most other societies, were going through at the time, these were relatively good institutions for economic development. What made England unique? One of the things that really made it unique is it had a really high rate of innovation. So I just described that, what they call the Malthusian trap, where you have a one-off innovation, it makes everyone better for a generation or two, and eventually you have more babies.
We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future.
The thing that England broke off on was it had such a high rate of innovation that even if people felt like they could have more kids, and they did very much so in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, the population of England exploded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But even if they felt they had more kids, the rate of innovation was high enough where they were still, they were not eating away all those extra efficiency gains. Like
the concept of quality of life was beginning to take hold, and things were improving.
Yeah, for everyone, not just the elites.
And if we go back a step, there was also a very important development. That's a printing press that set the stage for those developments.
Sure.
And it was a great experiment because the Islamic world and the Christian world handled culturally the advent of the printing press in a totally different way. And I guess you have a whole nother book on those developments, but it's worth diving into that too.
So the press, it's invented around 1450 by Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany. It spreads rather rapidly in its first 50 years. So by 1500, most big cities in Europe have a printing press. Now, what was happening in the Ottoman Empire? We know that in the Ottoman Empire by 1485, three or some odd decades after Gutenberg's has his press, the Ottomans know about the press. And there's evidence that beginning in 1485, they prohibit any type of printing in the Arabic script. Really, there's not really any printing until the early 19th century. Now, the question is why? The biggest losers from printing, potential losers, and almost certainly they would have been the biggest losers, would have been the religious establishment. The religious establishment had a monopoly over intellectual transmission, over the interpretation of the Quran and other religious texts. And this is something that would have almost certainly opened up to a much broader swath of the population. And this was the very thing that gave them power in the first place. So they had a huge incentive, if they could, to prevent the press. Now, a big difference between the Middle East and Western Europe is that religious authorities in the Middle East, Islamic clerics, still had a lot of political power. And there's huge implications from this. So one that eventually comes down the road, though not immediately, is literacy, of course. It takes a while, but by 1700 or so, there's reason to believe that at least in Northwestern Europe, the Dutch Republic and England, that literacy rates were at least above 50%. So by that period, even prior to industrialization, most people living in cities would have probably been able to read. And this does have massive implications down the road, because maybe the biggest consequence of the spread of printing in Europe was that it directly facilitated the Protestant Reformation. Then it really changed the politics in such a way where secular power the power of the economic elite became much stronger. And certainly was the case. And the leading Islamic empires, something like the Ottoman Empire, that's really not good for economic growth. And
they had a real live example of what they should be worried about in Islamic territories, watching the Reformation create this massive, monstrous movement that wound up being very violent. So there's one element that we didn't talk about that distinguishes this concept of economic growth, and that was the consistency, the persistence of economic growth over a period of time, which is what you delineate in the book, and I failed to raise earlier, but that's the key. And so you're trying to find those factors that have enduring impact.
Yeah, for sure. That's right. And I mean, because the thing that sets the modern economy off and makes it different from any other period in economic history is the persistence of growth. So even if you look at something like look at U.S. growth from 1800 to 2000, if you look at the overall chart, you can see the Great Depression in there, but it's a blip. The U.S. recovers and is right on track not that long after. Great recession, a decade and a half ago, very similar thing. So this is something where that's what needs to be explained, is the takeoff and the persistent takeoff. One thing that I think you kind of hit on it at the beginning, this disconnect between where the world is and people's views, I think, on today. And there's reasons to have
tomorrow.
Tomorrow,
It's
There's
like most
reasons to
people will say,
hesitate.
yeah, we're okay
Yeah.
today. But in 10 years,
Yeah.
we're screwed. In 20
Yeah,
years,
yeah,
we're
yeah,
screwed.
for sure, for sure. And I think, so I think there's a few things to be said on this, and we get back to the question. Sorry. One is that when, we call the book How the World Became Rich, we fully understand the whole world's not rich, of course, even by, not just by Western standards, by historical standards as well. But what we should say is that by historical standards, a large part of the world today is rich. So when we say rich, what we mean is something like $15 a day of per capita income. That's only like $6,000, right? That's not a lot by what certainly you're, if I'm assuming, a good fraction of your listeners are probably in the US or, in the West. That's obviously very low per capita income. But by historical standards, it's much, much higher than, what was typically the $3 to $4 a day, around $1,500 at most, at absolute most. And in fact, that would have been very wealthy. Historically, most people outside of a small set of elite were very close to subsistence. And we have moved away from that. Now, there are still places in the world that are at subsistence. And there's really two overarching reasons why the poorest countries in the world are very, very poor. One is governance. So a place like North Korea is very, very poor. That's just governance. And another one is, I think we can subscribe to some of the legacies of colonialism. Like the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world, and it faced one of the most vicious colonial enterprises under the Belgians that still has bad institutions, led to very bad, culture. And this was up through, early 20th century that really, I think, has made it tough for a place like that to escape. But for the most part, much of the rest of the world is so much better off than, we have this map that I think when Mark and I had the idea to do this, I thought it would be a really telling map. It's one of the very first figures in the entire book. We look at the countries in the world and we have a map of the entire world that are wealthier than Britain was in 1800. And the reason we chose Britain was because in terms of per capita income, it was the wealthiest country in the world in 1800. And with the exception of some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, North Korea, places where, and a couple others, most of the rest of the world is wealthier than the wealthiest country was just 200 years ago. Now, I know 200 years might seem like a long time, but in the span of the long span of human economic history, it's really not. And for this is something where even though it's been somewhat slow, I wouldn't even say it's that slow in terms of historical standards. The entire most of the world has been brought up. And
the percent of human population that lives at subsistence level and below is so much smaller today.
So much smaller. It was something where, our best estimates in around 1820 were around 90%. Lived on around $1,000 per year of modern day. Not this is all in real terms, just in case your listeners might be wondering about inflation. We're talking about this. We're talking about this all in real terms. So think about 2024 US dollars or something like that. Most people, about 90% of people, lived around $1,000 of per capita income per year, which is just the very, very basic of what you could what is needed to feed and clothe a small family and not feed them well. People were much shorter back then because they have very little protein in their diets. Frankly, their brain capacity was probably lower, not because of anything genetic, but because they did not have a very nutritious they did not have a nutritious childhood. And we know where there's plenty of evidence now that nutrition in childhood has a massive effect on brain functioning later in life. So when somebody asks me, when would be the best time to be born? I think with the massive caveat that, of course, we face climate change, and this is something that humans really, really are going to have to deal with. We face the specter of, something like a nuclear war or something like that. But of course, we faced that for a while now. I think the answer is still today. The best time to be born in human history is today, especially if you didn't know where you were going to be born.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that history review on how we got here and why progress has been so steady and consistent. Next week, we'll learn a little bit more about how it might have been accelerated and how that possibility still lies in the future with author Safdine Amos, who is publishing The Gold Standard, a new book of his, the third in a trilogy of the Bitcoin standard, the fiat standard, and the gold standard, where you can learn about how important the monetary system is to society. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care.